Stream, entitled American Negro Slave Revolts. This is chapter 1 of section 1 of a series of, information and a breakdown of a lot of slave revolts that happened here in the Western region we call America during the early parts of America's infant stage. As I give people a few minutes to come in, for those who are listening in, please give a comment during the end of every live stream, and please like the video as you come in before we begin. And like always, the purpose of these readings is to dispel the myth that the ADOS people in America just sit back and just allow to get, abused psychologically, physically, and that even one part of history that the presence of a Jim Brown or any other person that said they decided to come up and have a change heart to release you from the chains of enslavement. But through other histories, that is not the case. With all other authors and scholars from their information, that they actually dispel the myth of this so-called passivity, that the slave just took it and then, that was it. Chapter 2, the fear of rebellion. While there is a difference of opinion as to prevalence of discontent amongst the slaves, one finds very nearly unanimously agreement concerning the widespread fear of severe rebellion. This is true not merely among those historians who show some awareness of mass unrest, but even among the large number who either ignore or positively deny widespread plots and revolts. Thus, reference to this fear not infrequent, joined with the expression of wonder at the presence, are to be found in work dealing with the institution of slavery in Massachusetts, New York, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. The same is true of more extended studies by such scholars as James Schuldert, Hubert L. Ogud, William E. Dodd, Carl R. Fish, and Merle Q. Hawkins, or Hawk. with Urtrits by Phillips. Very recently, Clements Eaton devoted several pages to a discussion of this phenomenon. Of course, the discovery of a plot or the suppression of a rebellion and publicized involuntarily invoke fear, or invulnerable invoke fear. Indeed, terror, but these manifestations will be noted as they occur. There is also evidence that this fear exists quite independent of any connection with an actual outbreak. Military activities frequently provoke expression of alarm concerning the Negroes. Thus, one of the prime concerns of the official of Virginia in 1673 during the war with the Dutch was the possibility developed of dissatisfaction among the endurer servants and the slave. Difficulties with Indians, particularly of the Yamasee tribe, arose fear amongst South Carolinians as to the behavior of their slave at various intervals during the first third of the 18th century. This reached panic proportions, particularly in the Granville County, when it was discovered that fugitive Negro slaves were actively abating the Yamasees and Lower Creek Indians in boards foray during the 1727 and 1728. During the French and Indian War, pronounced worries concerning Negroes was evident in Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina. James Glenn, governor of the last of these colonials, in a message to the legislation on January 27, 1736, let me make sure that's 1756, acknowledged the existence of those fears and made use of it in a letter to the London Board of Trade of April 14, 1756. In a letter to the London Board of Trade protesting against the contemplating landing within South Carolina and about 900 Acadians, I think that's what they call it, alarm appears to have been even more acute in Virginia and the locale of much of the fighting, especially during the early and for the British and the disastrous years of the struggle in, and there's a subtitle here, the summer of 1755. The Colonial Charles Carter had informed Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie of setback inflicted by the French and their allies, and also of stirring on the part of the slaves. Dinwiddie replied July 18, 1755, that he felt the news of the French successors had been exaggerated, but he went on, the villain of Negroes of any emergencies of governor is with, I always fear, I greatly approve of the Yamasee, I think that's was with the short term with the Y, sending the sheriff with proper strength to take up these YT appeal in the body of YR and Son House, and if found guilty of the expression mentioned, I expect you will send for a commo to try them, and the example of one of two of the first may prevent those creatures entering into the combating and wicked designs against the subjects. In the meantime, you must act consistent with YR good sense and keeping patrols out of piece of Y Coty. I shall order an advertence in the paper as you desire, but with yet I think the sheriff should seize all horses used by Negroes in the night of time. Now, usually this is the man, and I'm not sure what language he was using, but this is Old English during the time. So as you know, when I use the Y and other expressions or letters, this is some language they used to speak back in the early 1700s, mid 1700s. So don't be alarmed by when I give the letters instead, because this is what was written on the book. Let's continue. 5 days later, Dinwiddie informed the Earl of Halifax that he found it necessary to leave a proper number of soldiers in each county to protect it from the combination of the Negro slaves who have been very anditious on the defeat in the Ohio. These poor creatures imagine the French will give them their freedom. The next year, the same official writer, at least 2 letters in his Superior England, contains reference of similar fears of mentioning the fact that presence of over 120,000 Negroes in a total population of the same 295,000 and made an unwise in order for the militant to any great distance from the press settlement is. The next period of major military activities, that of the Revolutionary War, also produced expressions of alarming concerning of the slave. John Adams record in his diary for November 24th, 1775, the visit of 2 Southern delegates in the Continental Congress, Abraham Bullock and John Houston, and note that these men felt grave concerns over the possibility that a British army might wage a war in the South under an anti-slavery banner, which they said would lead to 20,000 slaves flocking to it in a few weeks. These men remarked that the Negroes have a wonderful art of communication, intelligence among themselves. It will run several hundred of miles in a week or a fortnight. You get that? So they're talking about your ancestors were dumb and stupid. They have no communication. They were sadly mistaken. Very sadly mistaken. Let's continue. There are recurrent instances of this type of fear during the Revolutionary. Major General Charles Lee, for example, wrote 5 letters during the month of April 1776 while at Williamsburg, Virginia, stressing the importance of maintaining a firm control over the slave. The last letter in this series, dated April 16th, and addressed to Robert Morris, mentioned the possibility of a severe revolt, urging Morris to have 3 or 4 regiments from the middle colonials ready for reinforcement of the southern front in case of should materializing. When during the summer Lee removed his headquarters to Charleston, South Carolina, he was visited at the request by citizens from Georgia. These people brought him information about the extreme weakness of their region and the ravage of the British Navy to use the Florida by Indians of their base of Meridian. Hold on. Attack. Alright. And the wholesale fights of the slaves. Adding to these considerations the vast number of Negroes, we have perhaps of these sufficient to subdue us. In points of numbers, the black exceed the whites, and the ready channel of supply and secure retreat, while St. Augustine affords render them with the dreaded, or to be dreaded. A letter written July 31st, 1776, by Henry Whitecoop, a resident of Bucks County, Pennsylvania, to the local community of safe request and dispatching of ammunition in order to quiet the people in my neighborhood, who have been somewhat alarmed with fear about Negroes and disaffected people injure their families when they are in the service. conditions in South Carolina and eliminating by the reports of the Congressional Committee on the Circumstance in the Southern State submitted on March 29, 1779. The committee reports that according to the information furnishing in by the South Carolina delegate and Mr. Hunger, who had been sent north by the state governor in order to present up-to-date or up-to-the-minute data, South Carolina could not effectively employ its militants against the British. This was so because much of the forces was needed at home guard to prevent rebellion and fight amongst the slaves. It was this report that led the Congressional to suggest the freeing of arm of 3,000 South Carolina's slaves and their use against the English. This was spurred by the state authorities and led the council to recommend South Carolina withdraw from the conflict, a suggestion which was not followed because of General Montero's refusal to surrender. Another hit of evidence to this time involving Virginia's appearance in a letter by Colonel Wooding, dating Halifax County, July 21st, 1781. The writer lamented a lack of military equipment and remarks that some good gurus were owned by several of the inhabitants. But the owner, I am told, secretly them and say they will do it for their own defenses against insurrection of slaves and Tories reasons that seem to carry weight, with me at least. Very much the same situation prevailed during the years of the War of 1812. Just before the outbreak of hostilities in December of 1811, a Virginia slaveholder and Congressional John Rudolph dwelt of danger arise from the black population. He said he would touch this subject in tenderly as possible. It was with reluctance that they touched it at all. While talking of taking Canada, some of us are shuddering for our safety at home. I speak from fact when I say that the night bell never tolled for fire in Richmond. That the mother does not hug the infant more closely to her bosom. I have been a witness of some of the alarms in the capital of Virginia. A letter written by a resident of Charleston, South Carolina, in the summer of 1812 makes reference to the fear of those words. Consider, I beseech you, that the coast of St. Carolina and Georgia are principalities inhabited by the black population, which is not to be denied the whites are not able to control. A regiment of militants has been seen as from the interior for our protection, but they have mutilative. Thou the muti is arrested for the moment of spirit of its by no means quill. During the first year of the conflict with England, slaveholders in Georgia were distressed because of even tendering in East Florida from the Spanish possession Indians and fugitive slaves carriers of the guerrilla warfare against Georgia. Inhabitants. Moreover, American-born residents of East Florida, supported by United States soldiers and gunboats, attempts to unsuccessfully to overthrow the Spanish raiders. The forces mustered by the Spanish to resist this attacks include Negro soldiers, and this caused alarm among neighbors slaveholders. In fact, or in far off Mississippi territory, news of the outbreaks of war also accelerated by the even present dread of slave rebellions. Governor David Holmes, in a letter dated town of Washington, July 22nd, 1812, appealed to Brigadier General James Watkinson for the considerable quantities of muskets, rifles, powder, and lead. One factor behind this request was the possibility that the attitude of the Chilkat or Chickasaw Indians would change from friendship to hostility. But of greater importance were the slaves of these, said the governors. So let me pause right here. As much as the Europeans or the Pilgrims during that time in America during the 1700s, to me, they did not show or care much fear of the so-called Indian or the Native American, but they sure did care and had a greater fear of that Negro slave. I want people to pay attention closely on that, what I just read. They don't really care about the Native American. They know the Americans by default, where the population was small, big, was not really a threat, but the Negro slave was. And I wonder why. But let's continue to read to find out more. I entertained much stronger apprehension secretly a day passing without my receiving some information relative to the design of these people to insurrection. It is true that no clear or positive evidence of their intention has been communicated, but certain facts and expression of their views have just exceeded considerable alarms amongst the citizens. For my own part, I am impressed with the belief that the real danger exists and that it is my duty to lose no time in procuring arms for defending of the country. If you should not deem it correct to comply wholly with my request, I hope you will do so in part, for I assure you, sir, it is my firm belief that the safety of the citizens here may depend upon the procuring a sufficient number of arms and enable them to defend themselves against the dangers apprehending. When several weeks later the territory was called upon to dispatch a proportion of militants outside its borders, Governor Holmes again wrote to General Watkins and stressed the same problem. As remonstrants and petitions have been present to the start of the danger and to lie apprehending from the Negroes and Indians should the militants be marched out of the territory. To these representations I have given no answer, but I am of opinion that if you can dispense with the service of the caviar and furnish as with 200 muskets for the use of the militants that will remain at home, it will make the country secure against any probable difficulties and quite the fear of many good citizens. The detachment now campaigned near the cantonment of Washington consists of 1/4 of the physical forces of the countries corresponding with the Mississippi, well, actually counties comprised by the Mississippi District. Nearly 1/2 of the entry population are slaves, and the frontier counties are thinly inhabited. These considerations, I am confident, will have with your there just to wait. In slave countries, the danger of insurrection always exists, and the inhabitants should be prepared to meet the event. John Rudolph testified in the summer of 1813 that his forecast of panic made 2 years before was accurate. Since precisely the conditions had befallen the people of Virginia upon the governor called the militants to meet the British and distress of the alarming occasions by the relinquishing or requisition. He wrote, "Do not arise from fear of the prowess of the enemy, but of the effects of the climate and water of the Low Countries, especially at this season, and the dangers from the internal foe argument by the removal of so large a portion of our force. Of the result, you can form no conception. 1 year later, General Philip Stuart of the Maryland militants wrote to President Madison that many of the inhabitants of his state were in dire distress because of the fight and driven to distractions by fear as to what the slave might do. He noted that as a special precaution, the Negroes are ordered at night to retire to the height, lest the enemy from the faculty of movement should capture them. Here project may be engendered at which humanity shudders. If no aid is afforded us, I shall be compelled to dishand my militants to the end that by removing their families and remaining property into the interior of the country, they may have something from that general ruin that threatened them, and also that the enemy may not be strengthening by a species of force, but by us the most to be dreaded of any within his means. Okay, many citizens of Caroline County, Virginia, protest on August 3rd, 1814 against the governor, call upon their militants for an extra county duty on account of apprehension of Negro insurrections. At about the same time, the governor of Louisiana, Edward Tiffin, received a letter from a resident of the New Felicion commenting upon the dangerous state of affairs, what with the militant in a poor condition, many citizens disloyal, and the slave exceedingly dangerously. Many of the people declare they will not serve a tour of duty and leave their families to be plundered and butchered by the Negroes, etc. A letter from the Potomac, Virginia, Walter Jones to James Monroe, the Secretary of State, of dated December 20th, 1814, commented upon the fight of hundreds of slaves and the poor behaviors of the militants and their inadequate supplies. He declared that the last two factors render our general welfare as ludicrous and severe disasters can be made, and added, the dissatisfaction in the black is daily gaining extent and boldness, which may produce effects at the appropriation festival of Xmas, which is Christmas, that may bring a man mind and the Sicilian vesper of times past the same beating or heedless embellishment that destroys our efforts against the external enemy. Paralysis, everything like vengeance and police in respect to the more dangerous internal population. Public hopes has been highly raised and much rooted on the aid of the regime under Cole, Hamilton, and Wood, which certainly restrain the eternal evil. Where is he? He hears not a word about him. I beseech you, my dear sir, to hasten his march. Evidence of such fear recruit with the evidence of such fear recruit with the outbreak of the Second American Revolution. James L. Pettigrew, an outstanding South Carolinian, learns with regrets and surprise in January 1861 that his sister seems unwilling to return home from a North, for she said she lives in fear of insurrection. The wife of Senator James Chestnut Jr. in South Carolina felt the same way, as did the wife of Senior Louis T. Winkful of Texas. Mrs. Chestnut noted that her diary in March 1861 that William Henry Trescott, a former United States Assistant Secretary of State, spoke French at the dinner table and explained, "We are using French against Africans. We know the black waiter are all ears now, and we want to keep what we have to say in the dark. We can't afford to take them into our confidence, you know." Further evidence of sharp suspicion recurred in the most striking coming from Louisiana. There's a lady in Mortal Territory of Negro Uprising had provided herself with hatchets and tomahawks with a vital and some kind of spirit with which she intended to blind the dread rebellions when and if the fatal day arrives. Let me pause right here. As y'all know, at the time and during the 1800s, there was so many uprisings that these people were shook to their knees to the point where they have their own service that served them food. They had to talk by code. And I remember a brief conversation in regards to language, which I'm not going to talk too much about because language at this point is not really too much important, but it is relevant in the times you're in. That when you speak English, the language we call English is a bastard and a Germanic language. A language that most Americans, especially people that are ADS descent, do not grasp or understand perfectly. To really get a full idea and understanding of the English language, you will have to have the dictionary, either old or new, that breaks down every type of word, big or small, to have understand the meaning of it. And a question why even a lot of us today that either read good or read bad or even pronounce words and stuff, it all goes back to what you learned in the institution we call school in regards to language and word. Yes, we speak English in this country. We are aware of it, but how many of what we call Americans today understand, grasp English perfectly? Or the word English in all its phrase? Not that many. I'm telling you right now, not that many. Because y'all should know, or have an understanding, language is not just a form of expression, it's also a form of code, how you communicate with the opposite person. The person that can understand that person's language, i.e. code, are the ones that will able to move around better in society and able to say things about your knowledge. Keep that in mind. So let's continue. 10 to blind the dreaded rebellion when it fatal arrives. Okay. 2 fundamental considerations in the mind of the ruler of the South. Territorially. Anxiety, Anxiety, and the question of cessation invoked, and third, the problem of slave control. Whoever the first two were discussed, and the third frequent entering the picture, and the fact against showing the constant presence of the fear and the all-prevailing quality. The data demonstrations of the relationship of the formal territorial expressions with the fear concerning the slave behavior are numerous. Those, while it is a course true that American politicians and economic interests regarding or together with Napoleon financial distress and his defeat at Saint Domingo were on the basic importance and acquisition of the Louisiana territory, it is also a fact that another factor was present. Contemporary material demonstrate that a consideration so far as the United States was considered that appear to have had some importance was the fear that France of the liberty, equality, fraternity slogan might use Louisiana not only to detach Western land from the United States, but also to revolutionize the adjustments or adjacent slave population. While the area was still in the weak hands of Spain, a newspaper correspondent had written, "If the French once gets a establishment upon the Spanish territory in the vicinity of the southern states, it will behoove the planter to look well to his own household. Should the example of Santo Domingo be taught, thee shall be greater tribulation." The same consideration is stressed in the instruction given September 28, 1801, by James Madison, the Secretary of State, to Robert Langston, the newly appointed minister to France. Above all else, said Secretary Madison, Mr. Langston was to impress upon the French nation the numerous concerns of the United States over the port cessions of adjacent lands by Spain to France, and among other things. Mr. Langston was the point to be unrest which would occur among the slaves in the southern states, for they have been taught to regard the French as patrons of their cause. Fear became acute when it was definitely known that the areas was in French or France possession. This is part of what Hamilton had in mind when in 1803 he wrote concerning the transfer of sovereignty. This event treaty of early dismemberment of large proportions of countries, more immediately the safety of all southern states, and remotely the independence of the whole Union. The same year, Senator Wells and Delaware declared, "Let the French be but once settled in Florida and Louisiana, and they will have the whole of your southern states as their mercy." Unhappily, there is an inevitable enemy in every bosom of those states. You might as well attempt to stop the course of the plague as the arrest and the subdue and the dangerous spirit they would of the moment it suits their interests. Let those loose among the harlot of that country. Then you will have lightened up their domestic war, which would only be extinguished in the flood of your citizens. Another aspect of the question that received some attention was the possibility of using this western territory as a Negro colonization area, especially for this disposal of slaves who had already been shown to be dangerous. The foreigners' ownership of Florida had, ever since the early parts of the 18th century, distributed slaveholders in Georgia and South Carolina. The fact, moreover, that the Spaniards made a point of abating fugitive slaves and often enlisting them as soldiers was particularly annoying. The same conditions and practice continued after the American Revolution and were immediately source of irrationation between the United States and Spain. Thus continued for several decades, and the necessity of stopping it was one of the causes of the American-inspired revolution or revolt in East Florida in 1812 and 1813, which received considerable support from the United States, particularly from Georgia. The chain of military events that finally culminated in Florida annexation in 1809 was to a great extent created by the desire to wipe out the nests of hostile Indians and runaway slaves who used the swamps of Florida as haven of refugees and as basis from which to launch lightning-like attacks upon planetary against the borders, or plantation across the borders. These activities in turn increased the resentment of the slave population. And there's a subtitle here, which I'm not going to go into. You have to read that once you get the book. A typical statement of the case, one which preceded American military invasion under colonial clinches by but a few days, appeared in the Savannah, Georgia journals of June 26, 1816. Let me repeat that. Georgia Journal on June 26, 1816. This paper points to the existence of a strong and dangerous force of runaway slaves in the Florida fort at Apalachicola. I don't know if I pronounced it right. Apalachicola Bay, recently abandoned by the British officer Colonel Nicholas, and declare it was not to have been expected that an establishment so precocious to the southern states, holding out to a part of their population temptations to insubordination, would have been suffered to existing after the close of the war. In the course of the last winter, several slaves from the neighborhood fled to the fort. Others have lately gone from Tennessee and to Mississippi territory. How long shall this evil require immediately remedy by permitting to exist? The anti-slavery policy of Mexican governor was the prime cause of dissension between the state of America slaveholder residents in Texas and the Negroes of Texas learned of the Mexican anti-slavery regulation and grew restless, and so that their masters had to resort to barbarous methods of punishment in order to retain them. The desire to hold human properties more secretly is not to be overlooked in considering cause of the Texas Revolution or evaluating the reason for the American interest in the success of that efforts and ultimately an exoneration. Let me pause. All right. During the actual fighting between Texas and Mexico, fear, concerns that the slaves were greatly indeed, and the belief that the Mexicans would stir them to rebellion was widespread. Those worries may be found expression in the writings of such leading insurrectionists as Benjamin R. Millian, Heroto, A. Lisbury, Thomas J. Pilgrim, and Henry Austin. Stephen F. Austin himself, in a letter to his sister, Mrs. Mary Austin, wholly dated New Orleans, August the 2nd, 1835. Successfully states that feeling and fear of the group when they wrote that Texas had to be Americanized and Texas must be a slave country. It is no longer a matter of doubt. The interest of Louisiana requires that it should be a population of factually abolitionists or fanatical abolitionists in Texas would have a very pernicious and dangerous influence on the overgrowing population of the states. So, like, certain states were fanatic abolitionists. They didn't want no abolitionist slavery, from what I just read. A similar line of reasoning was used by the American envoys to England, France, and Spain, who meetings in Ostend in 1854 let the world know that, in their opinion, Cuba ought to belong to the United States. An important argument for this, they declare, lay in the possibilities that the slave of the Pearl of Antilles might emulate their brethren of San Domingo were the prize within the strong hands of the United States, she would not permit the flames to extend to our own neighborhood shores seriously to endanger or actually to consume the fore fabric of our Union. Fear of the slave population offers still another type of argument for territory expansion that was occasionally used, namely, in the idea that this expression may possibly and diffusion of the Negro inhabitants and thus lessen the possibility of a serious slave rebellion. The Virginia Congressman William Branch Gales, for example, made much of this point while arguing in March of 1798 against the prohibition of slavery in the territories of Mississippi, and it cropped up against in the speeches of these favoring, and this right here, I'll read this. Yet observe Professor Baker's own statements, there is an evidence of purpose of the part of the immigrants or of the slaveholders living in the United States to wrest Texas from Mexico to enlarge the slave areas of the South. It does not appear that anxiety concerning of the state of slavery played a appreciable part of the producing of the Texas Revolution in the influence of slavery of colonized of Texas. The Mississippi Valley of Historian Review, and these are the subparts of it, subtitles. Let's continue. Slavery in Illinois, and those argue of an exoneration of Texas in 1845. It was used by Representative Albert Gallienton Brown of Mississippi when in January of 1853 he called for the acquisition of Cuba. Lieutenant Matthew F. Maury, as leading personalities in bringing about the exploring trips of the American Herndon and Gibson in the Amazon Valley in the 1850s, which had as ultimate aim to absorption of the tremendous area by the United States, used by foreign language to justify this objective. I cannot be blinded to what I see going on here. It is becoming a matter of faith. I use too strong words. Yes, a matter of faith among leading Southern men that the times is coming, made that it is in rapid approach, when in order to prevent this war of race, its horrors, they will, in self-defense, be compelled to conquer parts of Mexico, Central America, and make slave territories of that, and that is now free, while of course slavery still prevails in Brazil. When the rulers of the Old South calculate the value of the Union, one of their prime considerations was question of the slave control. Some felt that it was not wise to repudiate a constitution which provides for the assistance of the entire nation if needed to surpass the insurrection other than secession. Even the peaceable accomplished would accumulate to the discontent of the Negro, and as results in war will certainly have the effects of this weakening of the South. James Monroe made this point in a letter to John C. Cullum. At the height of the later agitation against the high trifle, the elder states wrote, "As the union of all movements which meant of even suggests the least danger to it cannot fail to have an ill effect, none of the states are so deeply interested, according to my best judgment, in the preservation of the Southern rivalry, restraints of intercourse would immediately in use under partial confidences or confederations of any other arrangement." which could be form of the pernicious consequences of which may easily be conceived. Hostility and war would be inedible, whereby our free system of government would be overwhelmed. The southern states would soon become a scene of the most frightening calamities or frightful calamities because their slaves will be excited to insurrection. It is my candid opinion if there is any portion of the Union which ought to feel particularly solitude for the preservation, it is these states. Several months later, Monroe again wrote to Calhoun to reframe these statements. They were forming on longer reflection founded in experience and a particular consideration of the state of the southern county or southern country, especially in the article of slaves, a number of which, and most of them, exceed that of the white population. And again, James Madison, in a letter to Henry Clay, date June 1833, assured that later that he was right in believing that few northern people possessed unconstitutional designs on the subject of the slaves. Madison, moreover, as was his wont, emphasized the economic factors tying the North to the South as a guarantee that the former would not deliberately antagonizing the latter to the extent of forcing disunion. On the other hand, he went on what Madison in the South to look for. Greater safety is disunion. It would be worse than jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. It word of jumping into the fire for fear of the firing or the frying pan. And we'll stop here. All right, guys. Welcome again to another edition and a continuation of the reading, a previous reading, as titled American Negro Slave Revolts, Chapter 1, Section 2. And if y'all find the streams to be good and helpful, or you have any questions or comments, always, I always say this, and I'll repeat this again. Comment, subscribe, and like the channel. Always comment goes a long way to anything else. And one thing with these readings, they kind of help not only myself to understand the written word and the history, but also it should educate those that are not over the age 18, a little younger, that will go back to this. So, all right, we shall begin. Matter of fact, let me put let us begin, guys. For no further ado, we're going to continue from the previous reading. And like always, I'll be looking periodically from the chat room from time to time. During the secession state of 1850, the same concerns was frequently expressed by a person with a political axe to grind. The best example of this occurs in the speech of Horace Maney delivered in February 15 in his capacity as a representative from Massachusetts. Mr. Maney warned that were the lines of Mason and Dixie to be transformed into an international boundary, and the problem of fugitive slaves would mount to tremendous proportions, so that slavery will melt away upon your borders, like an iceberg in the tropics. And he asked, will separation bring relief and security? Immediately replied, no, sir, it will enhance the danger of married foes. Its agitations and instigations are evil now. Woe to those who would seek to mitigate or to repress them by the remedies of disunion and civil war. Let men who live in a powder mill beware how they madden protectionists and civil war between the North and the South. Anything that brings the quickening ideals of freedom home to the minds of the slave will unleash the bloodhounds of insurrection. Can you master armies in secret and march them in secret so that the slave shall not know that they are mastering and marching to perpetuate his bondage and to extend the bondage of his race? In Alabama, fire eaters, William J. Austin replied to this type of argument by minimizing the dangers flowing from the slave population and declared that in any case the Negroes were unarmed and unaccustomed to the use of arms and so could be suppressed without too much difficulty. The following decade of crisis brought forth a large crop of speeches, articles, and pamphlets, more or less devoted to a consideration of the effects of secession upon the slave behavior. The aged Josiah Quincy Applewhite remarks that the slaveholders' studies, thought, concealing are absorbed and directed to the two objects: how to keep their Negroes and subjects, and as subsidiary to this end, or subsidiary. How to keep the control of the free state by the control they present to the fear of their slaves and the arm of the Union, ever in readiness to keep them in subjugation, and also relieve themselves from the apprehension that their arm might be extended for the relief of their slaves. The months just preceding the Civil War witnessed particularly full discussion of the pros and cons of secession as a method of securing the ownership of human property. On one side, it was held that even peaceful and successfully secession by establishing a hostile border nation and by withdrawing the financial and armed support of the northern states would increase the difficulty of slave control, while its military action follows secession that of this difficulty would increase 100-fold and might well prove a decisive element in the South, defeating it, thus not only falling to gain independence, but also losing slavery and the other schools, emphasizing the hostility of the North, its agitation, propagandizing citizens in the anti-slave laws, and here is like a little small disclosure, which I'm not going to read. Continuing. And the unlikelihood that the region would aid in suppressing servile insurrection, supposing such assistance to the needed, and on the positive side, told the alleged power of a homogeneous, vast, expanded empire founded upon the pledge to maintain the cartel slavery. The Augustan Georgian Daily Constitutional of November 16, 1860, succinctly sums up an influential viewpoints in those words. Some of the southern states see in the tremendous popular majorities which has elevated Lincoln to the presidency and the large momentous wave that are heated down on the South with resistant force. And if she supinely waits for the deluge, must engulf the whole social system of South in the relentlessness waters of the anti-slavery fanaticism or fanaticism with them, and the question is secession from the Union and the self-defeating homogeneous Southern Republic, or submission of the Union and the fates of Jamaica and Saint Domingo. On the other hand, the anti-secessionist Wrigley, North Carolinian standards of February 5th, 1861 emphasized the difficulties of slave control in case of civil war and warrants. The Negroes will know too that the war is waged on their accounts. They will become restlessness, turbulent, strong government will be established and will hear heavy on the masses. The end will be abolishment. There are other considerations touching slavery, which we shall not refer to here. Every intelligent mind will at once understand as the will weighs these considerations for itself. In his last annual message, the Congress of December 3rd, 1860, President James Buchanan declared that the unrest of the slaves and of the terror has produced were prime causes of the apparent collapse of the Union. The efforts of territorial legislature and the Congression of preventing the expansion of slavery and of Northern people and their local governments to prevent the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act were evil which the South might have endured without endangering the Union, as others has been, in the hopes that time and reflection might apply and remedies, but he went on. The immediate perils arise not so much from those caused as from the fact that their inconsistent or insistent violent agitation of the slavery questions throughout the North for the last quarter of a century has at length produced its milding influence on the slaves and inspired them with vague notion of freedom. Hence, a sense of security no longer exists around the family altar. Thus, feeling a peace at home has given place to apprehensive of servile insurrection. Should this apprehension of domestic danger, whether real or imaginary, extend or intensify itself until it shall pervade the masses of the Southern people, then disunion will become inevitable. The form by no means exhausts the evidence establishing the fact that widespread fear of slave rebellions was characterized of the South. Many misconsensuous events or miscellaneous events also invoke from the time to time expansion of this dread. Thus, fear of the Negro formed one of the main justification used by the trustees of the Georgia settlement, and first forbidden and then opposed the establishment of slavery during the early decades of the 18th century. Again, one of the arguments South Carolinians urged upon English officials in 1769 to support their claim for a more western boundary for their province than the provide in the line of 1764 was that of this would add many white to this population and thus reduce the present danger flowing from the large slave population. This expansion of territory would too bring the Catawba Indians in the South Carolina borders, which it was asserted would be vulnerable since they were extremely useful in suppressing slave outbursts and captured runaways. The same fear was a permanent factor behind the law passing by Southern colonials from time to time, blocking the slave trade and their petition of the king for the same purpose, particularly just prior to the Revolution. It failed to, and the writings aimed at bringing about the outlawry of the nefarious business, as for example, those penned by the indefatigable and influential Quakers Anthony Benedict, and this was true, although as Benedict wrote, I know it is generally opinion that nothing ought to be published whereby the Negroes may be made acquainted with their own strengths and the apprehension of danger. The whites are in from them for the reason in every publication I have made. I have guarded against it, but I am persuading this fear may be earned or be carried too far, for it is certainly yet more dangerous to withhold from the generally of people and the knowledge of danger they will be endowed a continued importance of Negro slaves. Much of the same argument was made by George Mason at the Constitutional Convention in a speech of August 22nd, 1787, denouncing the slave trade. And 2 years later, James Madison cites the weakness and dangers arise from a slave population and presents Congress for the passage of a $10 duty on each slave import. The same body tabs in 1790 a quarter anti-slavery memorial, and one of the main points of the opponent commitment or consideration of the paper was the fear that anything else than outright projects will accord to Representative Admiral Burke of Georgia sound alarm and blow the trumpet of sedition through the southern states. American slaveholders trembled for their own security as they followed the tremendous revolutionary activities of the French West Indies slaves in the 1790s, and their always precaution sense of ease was further jeopardized by the appearance and tales of refugees arriving at Charleston, Norfolk, Baltimore, and Richmond. The analogy was too plain to be missed and led to the expression of sentiments like those contained in the letter by Thomas Jefferson. I become daily more and more convinced that all the West Indies islands will remain in the hands of the people of color, and a total explosion of white sooner or later will take place. It is high times we should foresee a bloody sea which our children, certainly and possibly ourselves, South and Potomac, have to wade through and try to avert them. Now, mind you, they already knew that these islands were going to be predominantly black. And the only reason why they were predominantly black, because if you look at all islands, Jamaica, Barbados, Virgin Islands, Trinidad, no matter how many they bring in from the west coast of Africa, particularly Ghana and Nigeria, the numbers will outlast the regular population that they were there trying to control a mass number of black people, Negro people. And they know they fear that the more of them, the more that the oppression they put on is going to be very dangerous on them. From reading that, that's why you don't see them really pressure too much of the islands. They have other methods of controlling the islands. As y'all see today, the islands are being controlled very well by hybrids, mulattoes, and other so-called race. Sometimes not in front of our face, but they're there. Don't be fooled. Let's continue. There was also persistent concern um, of least the rebellious slaves of these islands, inspired by a desire to free their brethren to the north, or as was thought more likely provoked by the French, might surreptitiously stir up slaves in the United States or actually invade the mainland for the purpose of an early example of such rumors as a letter from Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, dates Philadelphia, December 23, 1793, to the Governor John Drayton in South Carolina. And this is the letter. It is my duty to communicate to you a piece of information, although I cannot say I have confidence in it myself. A French gentleman, one of the refugees from Santo Domingo, informed me that two Frenchmen from Santo Domingo, also of the names Gaston and La Chassa, are about setting out from this place for Charleston with a design to excite an insurrection among the Negroes. He says that this is the execution of a general plan formed by the Brassenton party at Paris, and the first branch of which has been carried into executive execution at Santo Domingo. My information is a person with whom I am well acquainted, of good sense, discretion, and the truth of certainty. Believe this himself. I inquired of him for channels of the information. He told me it was one which had never been found to be mistaken. He explains it to me, but I could be no means considered it as a channel meriting relentlessness or relentlessness. And when I questioned him what could be the impulse of these men, what their authorities, what's their mean of execution, and what they could expect in the results, he answered with conjectures which were far from sufficient to strengthen the fact. However, were anything to happen, I should your judge I should deem myself inexcusable not to have made the communication. Your judgment will decide whether injury might not be done by making the suggestion public, or whether it ought to be or to have any other effects than exciting attention to those persons should they came into South Carolina. Cassian is described as a small, dark mulatto, a la Chassier, as a quatroon of a tall, fine figure. And that's how they talked back in the day. They, with the French, Let's continue. The fear that the French would use Negro troops from Santo Domingo to liberate the slaves in the United States and in the British West Indies, and then annex the later, if no more, was an important factor behind American and British diplomacy, particularly in 1799. A belief that a Santo Domingo politician, or politically independent of France, but economically depends upon Great Britain and the United States, would be less dangerous to the slave holding of both, was vital in bringing those two nations to the support of Toussaint. In June 1799, the three powers signed an agreement giving English and American ships exclusive trading privilege and requiring Toussaint to see it to that no person dangerous to the slave region of the United States of Britain Empire left the domain. According to Edward Steeves, the United States Consul General at Santo Domingo, and there's little small patches here. Toussaint kept his part of the bargain, and notwithstanding pardoning from France to aid in an attack upon Jamaica and possibly the southern portion of the United States. Seriously worries concern the possible activities of these issues or is landed rebellion independently or at the behest of France was expressed from 1797 to 1800 by the outstanding American including George Washington, Harris, Gray, Otis, Charles C. Pickering or Pickney, Albert Gallatin, and Henry Lee, three other George Keith, Taylor or Virginia, and John Redlich and Robert Goldlute, Harp, both of South Carolina, and all from federalism, which makes their apprehension of the new French subjects to the considerable dash of salt. Flatly asserted that agents of that government were sow seeds of revolution among the Negro. This concerns was factored in the rearrangement program of the federal government from 1797 to 1799 and in the anti-slave trade laws passed by the government in 1794 and 1800 and by various state governments from 1792 to 1801. Now, I'm not sure when they talk about Tucson. I'm not sure they're talking about Tucson and Dessalines in this particular paragraph I read. But, I'll let y'all figure that out. A Southern writer in the year 1801 and discussed the reality and magnitude of the dangers from the slave declared that all were as convinced of both as they were of the existence of the heaven and hell, a smile of very great strength at the time it was drawn. It is this quality of fear that is most impressed, its pervasiveness, deepness, which seem to add a distinctive element and electronical current to the very atmosphere of the slave region. Speaking under the stimulus of recently suppressed consent of 1801 to enlarge the militants, he warned that each passing day witnessed an addition to the number of slaves, and therefore he went on to the number of our most in a war with any European or even Indian power, they and the slave might be irresistible stimulate to vengeance. All right, let's continue. All right, the next governor of this era, William C. Callenborn, was keenly aware of the same dangers in 1802. Because of this, he attempted vainly to curb the importance of the adult male slaves, succeeding in strengthening the militants and in bringing about the establishment of the Fort de Horn at the town of Washington, about 6 miles east of Natchez. In 1807 and 1803, the influential Quaker Zachariah Dix through by the following religious to pose the gifts of prophecy and create among them in Georgia and South Carolina a condition approximately panicked by the warnings of an impending slave rebellion and a bloody civil war. Scores of Quaker family observed with fear migrating to the free northwest. While traveling through the South in 1805, Jonathan Mason, a former senator from Massachusetts, sensed the tenseness and wrote, "The citizen live in fear, and to avert the evil, to lessen the dangers, and to thin their population, employed the time and expense of the government of Virginia." Anyway, a resident of Baltimore versed in military science was so impressed in 1807 with the dangers that is pendent an extremely long letter to the President of the United States giving detailed proposals for protection against slave insurrection arrived at the said after considerable experience in combating such uprisings in the West Indies. The American-inspired revolution of 1810 in Spanish-held West Florida invoked expressions of fear of the slave population both there and in the neighboring Mississippi territories. So many of the West Florida settlers had left their homes to take part in the successful storming of the Baton Rouge for September 1810 that their families appealed to the American officers, Colonel Hugh Davis, stationed in nearby Homosito in Mississippi, for troops to prevent slave uprisings. David relied this request to Governor David Holmes on September 25th and remarked that he feared a Santo Domingo across the horde unless a display of force were made. 3 days later, the governor gave the army a commander, Conley Thomas, crushing orders to station a company of soldiers at the West Florida borders in order to ensure the good order of the slaves both north and south of that line. The question of Missouri admissions into the Union brought slavery to the fort, led to heated debates in Congress, and so unusually brought expressions of concerns over the Negro population. An example of this is contained in a letter dated February 20th, 1820, states that the passage of the Missouri Compromise would lead to Northern domination, and I have no doubt from the language ascribed to Mr. King would sound that the Tuscan of freedom and every Negro of South, and we may live to see the tragedy events of Santo Domingo repeat in our own land. Now let me pause right here. And the reason I'm pausing to let people know is because the ancestors or people that were AUS and descendants, slaves from America to the Caribbean, especially the Caribbean, and in some parts of America. It has brought in fear, great fear to a lot of Europeans, men of that time, because the black man or the AUS man was put so much resistance in his oppression that he wanted to risk his own life by any means necessary in the plight for freedom. And this has not been talked about in history. Hell, a lot of history books now are not teaching none of this. And the reason why, because they teach you how you overcome your oppression. And you have to make your enemy have to change his tactics on how he deals with you. You're going to doomly repeat badly. So let me continue. At the end of 1820, the Charleston Courier notes that 3 interesting papers from the unknown writer under the signature of a Carolinian were laid on the desk of the members of the state legislature a few days since, which pointed to a danger of permitting the continued growth of the Negro population and urged the adoption of measures to check this alleged menace to the secure possession of human property. The depths of this concern is well indicated in a letter written to Thomas Jefferson by an old friend, Thomas Law. Mr. Law remarks that he was greatly unnerved by terrible personal affections, including the death of 2 children, yet he went on, he felt that he could lay down in peace if he could but see his country actively promote, manufacture, better its transportation facilities, and a system inducing the check the reply increase of slaves in the South, which may be added by Haiti and Cuba in the West. Sir, but there is too much warmth on this subject for calm discussion. A prominent South Carolina slaveholder placed considerable strength in 1825 on this dangerous and what was unusually did so in a public address, warning that The tenure by which we hold our slaves is daily becoming less secure. A Virginia owner and politician of the next year also public and even more strongly admits the presence of this deep fear, warning of the possibilities of a tremendous Negro uprising, even of a successful one. Lie went on. I wish I could maintain with truth that it was a small danger, but it is a great danger. It is a danger which has increased, is increasing, and must be diminished, or it must come to its regular catastrophe. It is an arresting coincidence, probably based on the increased evidence of slave unrest, that in a month just before the Tanner or the Nat Turner rebellion and its aftermath of turmoil, there were several striking prophecies of impending catastrophes. Thus, an English visitors to New Orleans in 1830 remarks that the evil of slavery were beginning to reenact upon the Christians, who are lately in a constant state of alarm, which threatened at to fear the state period to overwhelm the South with some dreadful calamity. Again, the Reverend Samuel J. May in July 1831 warned the slaves are men. They have within them the extinguishable thirst for freedom, which is born in man. They are already written in their shackles. They will one day throw them off with vindictive violence. If we do not unloose them, Benjamin Landy in the Baltimore Monthly Paper for August 1831 declared before news of Turner uprising had reached him, vengeance is accumulating in the land of disposition or deposition, and it will assuredly burst forth with tremendous fury. Its justice be not admitted to a participation in the council of those in authority. The great English actress French Anna Kimball, who spent several months in 1838 and 1839, and the mistress of the large Georgia slave plantation, wrote, "While there, I know that the Southern men are apt to deny that they do live under an habitual sense of danger, but a slave population concerned into obedience, though unarmed and half-fed, is a threatened source of constraint and security, and even Southern women to whom I have spoken on the subject have admitted to me that they live in terror of their slaves." A New Orleans newspaper felt in 1841 that the enmity between the whites and black race is rapidly maturing. I think it's enmity. And note that recent repeats attacks of the Negro upon the white man in our city, and wonder whether they be not the banquet guards of some stupendous conspiracy among the blacks to fall upon as unvert. And the paper urged various measures of repression as the forbidden and the manumission and its religious gatherings, and conclude, "Let us always be on our guard, and grant the indulgence to the Negroes, but keep him strictly and vigorously within his sphere." Indications of anxiety comes from Maryland early in 1843 in the agitation for the outlaw of all secret Negro organizations was considered, and the Baltimore grand jury presents the Negro Masonic Lodge as particularly dangerous. Again, a letter from Clarksville, Georgia, on February 2nd, 1844, demonstrate the existence of very acute fear. A sentence here indicates an interest appreciation of the profound revolutionary implications of the entire abolish movement, in that the writer remarks that the same torch which he fears will consume the fabric of the slave South will also cause the northeastern horizon to coruscate with the flames of northern places. Let us then be urged, secede now, and what will it avail us at the South for the incendiaries to cease their work after our throats are cut and our house burned? Sir, the Negroes in Georgia are already saying to each other that great men are trying to set them free and will succeed, and many other expressions are similar imports. And if negation of the subject of continue for 3 months longer, we will compile to arm our militants and shot down our properties in the fields, if that thing is not already accumulating, telling the agitators we had rather fight than our own Negroes, than we will do it too. As one might expect, the critical decades prior to the Civil War presents much evidence of the presence of this envelope, since the implement committees. Emily P. Berkeley declares that she was a witness of this while in Georgia, and remarked that she had known ladies that would not date to go or dare go to sleep without 1 or 2 pistols under their pillows. Frederica Brenner, a famous Scandinavian writer, reports a conversation with a former planter in Louisiana at about the same time, during which the gentleman declared people are becoming compelled to more justice and gentlemanliness towards their slave for their own sanity, or their own safety, actually. Typo. I have known times here when there was not a single planter who had a calm night rest there. They never lay down to sleep without a brace of loaded pistols at their side. James Sterling, an English traveler, was in New Orleans at such a time, the winter of 1856, and note at this moment the planter lay himself to bed with pistols under his pillow, never knowing when when the wild whoop of insurrection may awaken him to a bloody fight. Is it pleasant to live in such a country? I have slept for night over the boiler, and can tell you it is very far from pleasant. Another visitor, Frederick Law Olmsted, during approximately the same time, repeatedly comment upon the pervasiveness of the fear of finding no part of the South where the slave population is felt to be quite safe from a continuation of insurrectionary incitement. He too, as Sterling reports, that upon retiring with the roommate in a Louisiana public inn, that the man carefully loaded his gun and barricade the doors with the remarks, "You don't know, there may be runaways around the same condition," impressing the shrewd Edward Lawrence Goldwyn. While in the South during 1856 and 1857, to whom a unarmed or unmanned ex-governor of Mississippi also hint at rather restless sleeping, the politician lament to disproportionary growth of the slave as compared with the fear of the free population, and assert that the difference was now felt to be so alarming, the great that many people never lay down at night without fear that their throats might be cut in his sleep. A Missouri newspaper, in argument of the adoption of the policy of emancipation, stressed the sense of even present danger, which was, it maintains, characteristic of systems it wished to see ended. It demanded to know who the watching passing events and indication is not sensible of the fact that great internal convulsions await the slave state, and it held it better to grapple with the dangers in times. If danger there be and avert it, then wait until it becomes formidable. One thing is certain, or history is no guide, that is that the slavery cannot be perpetuated anywhere. And that's the end of chapter 2. And I give my feedback and comments. Now, mind you, they never taught this in school. You think that your ancestors sit there wait for them to change it? No, they had no choice over time because of a lot of slave rebellions. Before that term came into the picture with slave revolts, there were many slave revolts during the 1700s going out to 1800s. Some particularly in the West Indies and some here in America. Before Nat Turner did his thing back in the early parts of 1800s. As you know, a lot of Europeans at the time were feared their life. Some can't even sleep well at night because they feel they might sleep and one day might not wake up with their necks cut off. So when people talk about say that Lincoln freed the slaves or any of these people tell you free the slaves, and mind you, this is just the stepping stones of this into this history. And this is history that most people don't look at. Hell, some of us don't even teach our children this, but we wait for the school system to teach you this. They cannot afford to teach that. No, they can't afford to teach that. Because teaching that is going to reveal the truth about them and you. And that show what you did and how you got to this point. Now I'm not sure what the future holds, move on what we see here in today's world we live in today. But to know one thing, with great men and women sitting down and hoping that, some spirit in the skies can come save you, that's not a reality. You're not going to see that. That's not going to happen anytime soon. And it shouldn't. People back then and even now, they had to put in some form of work. Praying your way or, thinking that things will get better, you're going to get the same results. And the answers back then did show what they did under oppression. They didn't sit down and take it. Some of them take it, and some of them fought and lost their life. And some of them probably fought and fled to freedom. At the end of the day, you should know and have a great understanding. One thing you should know is that as we go deeper into the rabbit hole of these revolts, we have to get a clear understanding that, what really played into really now that Lincoln came in, that he has to make a decision to start free the slave. Because he had to make a decision. And a lot of Europeans, from what has been read so far, had to agree with this decision what Lincoln made. Regardless, they said they didn't agree with, they had no choice. Because you cannot sit there, continue the route of slavery, and you can't sleep well at night. To know so any time your slaves could uprise and take you out. So, I would end this on this note. I'd like to thank everybody that was watching today's stream. Be on the lookout for the next stream. Until next time, take care now.